Hello, this is Murray Carter from CarterCutlery. The other day, I posted a video on Instagram and Facebook of me cutting up a box with a kitchen knife. It was really fun. It was impromptu. It wasn't really meant to be very formal. I had simply received a kitchen knife back that I didn't make, but one of our bladesmiths, Adam Andrews, had made. The kitchen knife is here, one in question. And the customer said, look, I cut a bunch of vegetables with it, and then it wouldn't cut tomatoes or bell peppers afterwards. So what's going on? Well, that's a good question. I do have a video on YouTube called What Dulls Knives? And the point I make on the YouTube video is that if you're cutting vegetable matter on an appropriate cutting surface, which would be like a polypropylene cutting board or a wooden cutting board or something, some of those bamboo cutting boards, they're held together with resin and some really hard glue. And so it's not the bamboo that would dull the knife, but the glue that's in those cutting boards can hurt those things. So, and obviously you never want to cut on a granite countertop. You never want to cut a donut on a plate. Any of those things that are harder than the steel itself will just immediately take the edge right off a knife. Doesn't matter how good the steel is, how good the quench, how good the temper, etc. But we're talking about, we can look here, I've got some tomatoes, I've got a bell pepper, I've got my cutting board, I have some cardboard and some paper, and I've got some stones here in the background just to touch the knife up as necessary, because sharpening while you're using a knife is part of the big picture, because unless you're using a knife made out of diamonds, it's going to get dull with use. It's just steel after all. So there are some techniques that I've taught over the years that, while not very empirical, they're very subjective. But if you do them over and over and over again, they're actually, in my experience of having made 29,000 knives and hand sharpened over 135,000 knives, a very accurate indicator of what's going on. The first is what we call the three-finger test of edge sharpness. Okay, here's a knife that's shaving sharp. Okay, I just sharpened it a little bit ago. I refurbished this knife in order to send it back to the customer, and here we are messing it up again, but no worries, we'll refurbish it again. So shaving sharp, and I do the three-finger test of edge sharpness by taking my support hand, putting the thumb of my support hand on the back of the blade. I'm holding it in nice and tight, and I put my three fingers on there, and I don't brush my fingers back and forth, but I attempt to move my fingers laterally on the cutting edge. And when the blade is razor sharp, your fingers and your brain, everyone tells you stop. When the knife is dull, you can slide it back and forth. This isn't meant to be a big long video on the three-finger test of edge sharpness. I address it elsewhere. Just check out YouTube, check out three-finger test of edge sharpness. But if you do that with every single knife you sharpen and every knife you use, you will build up a wealth of data as to when knives are really sharp, when they're not. If they're not cutting, you can check. If certain sections of your blade, like the belly or the heel or the tip, are not cutting very well, you can always double check with using the three-finger test of edge sharpness. Another technique I've been teaching throughout the years that's very subjective but very, very informative is something that I learned from a machinist. I'm holding the blade in my right hand and I'm grinding it and I'm trying to make it is this going to be a good kitchen knife, or is this going to be a good outdoor knife, or is this going to be a good neck knife? Well, it all has to do with the play between the primary and the secondary edge geometry. So one way I can double check the secondary edge geometry is I put my thumb and my middle finger on the spine of the blade, and ever so slowly at different places of the blade, I draw my fingers down, and that's going to tell me where am I thick, where am I thin. And if a blade is like really thick down here towards the cutting edge, it'll feel like same thickness, same thickness, same thickness, and then it'll like drop off like the cliffs of Cardiff, okay? So you can feel that. You can feel that. And then when you cut some things and it cuts real well, and then you double check to see how it feels, in your mind, you can really build up an amazing data, a wealth of data as to what kind of edge geometries cut through things differently, okay? Because it's the primary edge that we did the three-finger test of edge sharpness on that allows you to initiate the cut, but it is the secondary edge geometry that allows you to push through things. Now, whether that's through leather, cardboard, or through a tomato or an acorn squash, it has more to do with the secondary edge geometry than it does the primary edge geometry. Okay, that being said, now I want you to look down here. We've got a pile of cardboard. The other day I took this knife, and this is the actual, these are remnants from the actual box I cut from 2 or 3 days ago. Something very interesting to note is where it's cut, like that was ripped, but where it's cut, There's no tear out. There's no little fibers coming out. Like, I cut this thing probably 50 different times, and it was still cutting through with abandon and cutting through easily. Now, the reason why cardboard is such a great medium to test your cutting performance of your blade is that when they make the cardboard, obviously it's a wood product. And they lace the wood fibers together, but there's a lot of gaps, and they basically fill that with mud. That's why cardboard is brown, and that's why the little rocks in the mud is why when you cut cardboard, it typically dulls knives very quickly, because you're essentially cutting through dirt. That's what cardboard. If you ever burn cardboard and you see a whole bunch of brown sediment left in your fire pit, that's all the mud from the cardboard. The wooden fibers burnt up and the mud's left over. Okay, so let's say if we take something like a piece of paper like this, okay? And first, let's start this by cutting a tomato. Okay, cuts a tomato very, very nicely because it's freshly sharpened. Okay, when we cut a piece of paper, it's a good test of the primary edge geometry, but it's not a good test of the secondary edge geometry because that paper folds away from the cutting edges I'm trying to push through, as you can see. So the thickest knife, so long as it's been honed very well, will still cut through that paper. That's not a big test. But cutting through something like cardboard, not only do you have to cut into the cardboard, but you have to cut through it. And cutting through that is more of the secondary edge geometry. And as you can see, that you can even hear it. Just listen. Very, very smooth cut, beautiful cuts there. We can come back. We can see we can still cut the tomato. Now, at some point, this is not going to cut the tomato as well as it did the first time because I'm cutting through cardboard, which is like cutting through mud. So I am not saying that you can cut through cardboard all day long and still cut a tomato as well as you could as when it was freshly sharpened on the stones. But there's 4 or 5 cuts. Let's do a few more. I'm cutting through double here. And we come back, cut the tomato. With each successive cardboard back to tomato, I'm gonna have to put a little bit more slicing motion into cutting the tomato. The blade is getting dull as I cut the cardboard. There's no 2 ways around that. Now look at this cardboard box here. Whereas the cardboard I was just cutting is basically paper with the corrugation in between, this cardboard is like 2 of those stuck together. This is a reinforced box, as you can see. So cutting not only into this is going to be more difficult, but cutting through it is going to be more difficult. Okay? But we can see that this kitchen knife, okay, that's a bad angle. Okay, and again, let's look at this cut. Pretty smooth. Nothing's really getting ripped out or anything. We come back to the tomato. Still cutting a tomato. Will it cut into a bell pepper? Yes, look. Even with very little movements, cuts right into that bell pepper. Okay, we come back, cut some more cardboard. Come back, cut the tomato. Getting a little bit of resistance there just towards the end. And of course, here I'm cutting through the stem, but it still cut clearly through the stem and didn't push the stem to one side or the other. Okay, so what have we learned here? We learned that if I just wanted to see how many cuts this would make in vegetables, I'd be here all day trying to dull the knife, because cutting soft vegetable matter on the appropriate cutting board will not significantly dull a knife to the point that you're going to notice it over time. Over 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a few months, you'll notice it. Not in the span of 5 minutes or 10 minutes. However, throw in some cardboard and start cutting that. Okay, so throw in some cardboard and come back and keep cutting. test to see if it'll shave. This is going to be an accelerated performance test that you can do in a short amount of time. Now, obviously, this knife now is not as sharp. It's not too bad. There's a little section here. It's razor sharp here and here, right here where I've been doing most of that cutting. It's not as sharp, I can tell with the 3 fingers. So to be able to come back to your stones with use, to be able to come back to your stones. Oh yeah. Just crazy right through this label here. Yeah. Just cuts with abandon, right? So, of course, look, you can see the mess I've made here. I've done a lot of cutting. I've cut some vegetables. This is a great way to test a knife. You test with a 3-finger test of edge sharpness. You test with thickness. You cut through things. You cut through cardboard. You come back and cut your test medium. Go back and forth. And while I'm not really collecting empirical data, because I do this all the time with all sorts of different knives, subconsciously I'm making an assessment of this knife that's very accurate. And I can tell you, great edge geometry, great for vegetables, great for cutting cardboard. If it'll cut through that cardboard with very little resistance, it's typically going to go real well with vegetables, so long as you don't make the blade too thin, which almost never happens. You know, I learn a lot by doing this all the time, and you will too. So I give a special thanks to Calvin Kemp of Kemp Customs Knives, who makes knives with his dear father down in South Africa, who's also studying to get his PhD. And he kind of challenged me to, if I'm going to be talking about cutting tomatoes, you know, show people cut tomatoes, incorporate the cardboard in there, and try to kind of give the total picture to my customers and to my followers and to our loyal patrons. So thank you very much. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you now go take all your knives and go cut all your cardboard boxes so that they'll fit in that recycling bin real tiny. Okay, thanks very much. Season's greetings from Murray Carter at Carter Cutlery.